Captain Aaron Voss had seen countless battles, but this one felt different. The Selkar Dominion had launched a surprise attack on the Galactic Alliance fleet, and the brutal confrontation left both sides battered and broken. The sky was littered with debris from destroyed ships, their twisted remains scattered across the barren desert moon of Varys IV. Aaron stood on the edge of a steep cliff, his tactical visor scanning the horizon for any signs of survivors. The sandstorms of Varys IV made it nearly impossible to see more than a few hundred yards, but there was something faint, amid the wreckage below. His heart quickened. It wasn't just a piece of a ship, it was a pod, an escape pod. He activated his communicator. "Command, this is Captain Voss. I've found an escape pod. I'm going down to investigate." "Negative, Captain. You're ordered to fall back. The situation is critical." "We're evacuating the area," came the static-filled response. "Repeat, fall back." Aaron hesitated. He was no stranger to following orders, but something about this mission felt different. The thought of leaving someone behind, especially a potential survivor, didn't sit well with him. He had always believed that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their technology or weaponry, but in their ability to fight for others. That belief drove him now. He wasn't going to leave this unknown survivor to die. "Understood, Command. But this isn't over," Aaron muttered to himself as he powered down the communicator. "I'm not leaving anyone." The descent was treacherous. The rocky terrain of Varys IV wasn't kind to anyone who wasn't careful, and Aaron had to carefully make his way down, using the sides of cliffs and jagged rocks for support. Sweat dripped down his face, stinging his eyes beneath the heat of the twin suns overhead. The wind howled, carrying the scent of the planet's dry, dust-choked air, but Aaron kept moving. He knew every second counted. When he finally reached the site, he knelt beside the escape pod. The hatch was damaged, but still intact. With a few swift motions, Aaron pried it open, unsure of what he would find inside. His hand hovered over the controls, uncertain whether he was about to uncover the body of a fallen soldier or something else entirely. The hatch opened with a hiss, revealing a small, injured figure inside. It was not a human. The alien girl's skin was a deep shade of violet, with markings that seemed to shimmer faintly against the light. Her face was delicate, with large almond-shaped eyes that seemed too deep for her small frame. She was breathing, but barely, her body covered in cuts and bruises. Blood stained her clothes, and her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. He had seen many alien species in his time, but nothing like this. Her slender body suggested she wasn't human, but he could feel a sense of intelligence and life in her, even in her unconscious state. The instinct to help surged within him. Without a second thought, he scooped her into his arms and began making his way back to safety. The escape pod had crashed far from his landing site, and there was no telling how long she had been stranded. He couldn't afford to waste time. As he carried her, he found himself studying the girl's features. Despite her foreign appearance, there was something oddly familiar about her, a kind of softness, a kind of vulnerability that reminded him of his younger sister back home. He shook the thought away. There was no time for distractions. He reached his makeshift camp just as night began to fall. The temperature plummeted on the moon, and Aaron hurried to get a fire started. He laid the girl on the ground beside the campfire, using his med kit to clean her wounds as best as he could. The blood was thick, darker than human blood, but Aaron had dealt with many alien injuries before. He had the knowledge, the training. It was the one thing that had always kept him calm in the chaos of battle. As the hours passed, the girl's condition improved slightly. She began to stir, her eyelids fluttering. Aaron sat by the fire, watching her closely. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly opened her eyes, her violet pupils focusing on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Aaron was unsure of how to address her. She wasn't human, and yet she seemed so fragile, so full of life. Where am I?" Her voice was soft, trembling, but her tone carried a strange grace. "Varys 4," Aaron replied. "You were in an escape pod. You were hurt. I found you." Her gaze flickered to his face. There was confusion, then recognition in her eyes. "You are human." "Yes," Aaron said, nodding. "I'm Captain Aaron Voss of the Galactic Alliance." She studied him for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing as though she were searching for something deep within him. Then she slowly nodded. "I was left to die," she whispered, her voice cracking with pain. "My people abandoned me." Aaron felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "but you're not alone now." The girl's lips trembled, and she tried to sit up, wincing from the pain. "I am Lyra," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I was a scout for the Merrics. The Xilkar, they came. They destroyed us." Aaron listened carefully, but before he could respond, a low rumble echoed across the desert. The sound of an approaching ship, maybe more Xilkar forces. It seemed like their nightmare was far from over. But Aaron had already made his decision. He wouldn't let anyone, no matter who they were, face the darkness alone. "Lyra," he said, his voice steady, "we're not going anywhere. Not until you're safe." And so, with the fire flickering in the distance, a new chapter began. It would be a journey neither of them had anticipated, but one they would face together. The night on Varys 4 was cold, the kind of chill that made Aaron's bones ache as the wind howled across the barren landscape. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. Aaron kept watch, his eyes scanning the distance. He had no idea how long he would need to stay on this forsaken moon, but he wasn't going to leave Lyra behind. Not now, not after everything she had endured. Lyra was still resting by the fire, her breathing steady but shallow. She had told him her name earlier, but there was something in her eyes that said she was far from healed, physically or emotionally. She had lost everything. Her people, her home, her purpose. Yet, in the brief time he had known her, he could sense something else beneath her pain. Strength. She was a survivor, in more ways than one. Aaron rubbed his eyes, weary from the events of the day. The escape pod, the fight with the Xilkar forces, the long journey through the harsh desert. Everything had been a blur. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. Lyra had mentioned the Xilkar, but she hadn't said why they had attacked her people so mercilessly. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a crackling noise came through his communicator. It wasn't the usual interference from the storm. This was different, clearer. "Captain Voss," a voice crackled through. It was Commander Oren, his superior officer. "What is your status? We've been trying to reach you." "I'm fine, Commander. I found a survivor, an alien. She's injured, but I'm taking care of her," Aaron replied, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He knew he was pushing the limits of protocol, but right now, Lyra needed him more than anything. "An alien." Oren's voice was sharp, a tone that Aaron had learned to recognize. "What do you mean by that? Do you realize the risk you're taking by harboring an alien? The Xilkar will find you, Captain. You need to leave that place now." "I'm not leaving her, sir," Aaron said firmly. "She has information. Information that could help us win this war. I'm not abandoning her to die. Not again." There was a long pause before the commander spoke again, his voice low. "Understood. But be aware, Captain, that you may be in more danger than you realize. There are rumors that not all is as it seems with the Nerrics. You need to be cautious." Aaron frowned, confused. "Rumors? What do you mean?" "I don't have all the details, but there are reports that some of the Nerrics have been working with the Xilkar. We don't know who, but you need to consider the possibility that this girl might not be who she says she is." The words hit Aaron like a slap to the face. He looked over at Lyra, who was still resting by the fire, her eyes closed, unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. Could she be lying to him? Was she part of the enemy? The thought made his stomach twist, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had to trust her, for now. "I'll keep my eyes open, Commander. But I'm not going to leave her," Aaron replied, his voice firm. "I'll report back once I have more information. Don't make a mistake, Voss. We can't afford another one." The transmission cut off, leaving Aaron in silence. He sighed and put the communicator back into his pack. He turned his attention to Lara, watching her closely as she stirred in her sleep. There was no sign of betrayal in her expression. No hint that she was hiding something. If she was deceiving him, she was doing it well. But the truth was, Aaron didn't want to believe it. He had to believe that she was telling the truth. She had to be. A sudden sound made him freeze. Footsteps crunching on the sand, faint at first, but growing louder. Aaron's heart raced as he quickly crouched down, reaching for his rifle. The last thing he needed was more Selkar forces. His eyes darted around the camp, looking for a place to hide or escape. The wind had picked up, and the sandstorm was getting worse. It would be difficult to see much beyond a few feet. He gently shook Lara awake, whispering urgently, "Lyra, wake up. We've got company. Stay quiet." She opened her eyes slowly, her violet pupils dilating in the dim light. She looked at him, confused at first, but then her gaze shifted to the direction he was watching. Her eyes narrowed, and her hand moved toward her side, where Aaron had noticed a weapon earlier. She was ready. "They are coming for me," she said softly, her voice steady. "The Selkar won't give up until they find me." Aaron's mind raced. He had to protect her, but he wasn't sure how many were coming or what he was up against. He stood up slowly, scanning the area. The footsteps were getting closer, and he could hear the low hum of an engine in the distance. There was no time to waste. "Can you fight?" Aaron asked, his voice low. Liara nodded. "I can fight, but not like you. I'll use my mind." Aaron didn't know what that meant, but he didn't question it. He had seen strange abilities in other alien species before. He motioned for her to stay low as he adjusted his weapon. They had to move quickly, or it wouldn't survive. The footsteps grew louder, and Aaron's heart pounded in his chest. He quickly surveyed the area again. There was a narrow ravine nearby, one that would offer some cover. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best chance. "Follow me," he whispered, and they both moved toward the ravine, staying as silent as possible. Just as they reached the edge, a shadow appeared in the distance, moving toward them. Aaron's fingers tightened around his weapon as Liara stood by his side, ready for whatever was coming. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, and Aaron had to believe in that, no matter what came next. The wind howled, carrying dust and sand through the narrow ravine where Aaron and Lyra hid. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts racing. The approaching footsteps were now unmistakable, and the sound of engines hummed in the distance. Aaron motioned for Lyra to stay close, his rifle held tightly in his hands. He knew they couldn't afford to make a sound. Any noise, and their position would be compromised. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes focused, her body tense. She didn't speak, but Aaron could feel the intensity radiating from her. There was a strange calmness about her, even in the face of danger. She wasn't afraid. She had already been through so much. Aaron wasn't sure if he could say the same for himself. His fingers tightened around the rifle. He had been in plenty of tight situations before, but this felt different. This was personal. "What do we do now?" Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Aaron didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the darkening sky, searching for any signs of movement. The sound of the engines had grown louder, and the footsteps seemed to be getting closer. He knew they were running out of time. If the Selkar found them, it would be over. "We're going to stay quiet and stay hidden," Aaron replied, keeping his voice low. "I'll handle the fighting if it comes to that. Just keep yourself out of sight, okay?" Liara nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. It was a strange mixture of determination and something else, something softer, something human. It reminded Aaron of his younger sister, back home, before the war had taken everything from him. He quickly pushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time for distractions. The footsteps drew nearer, and Aaron's heart pounded in his chest. He could see the silhouettes of the Scifi soldiers now, their large armored forms making their way through the sand. The Scifi were relentless in their pursuit, and their tactics were brutal. There was no mercy in their eyes, just cold, calculating intent. They were here for Lyra, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. Aaron's eyes narrowed. He had to act fast. There was no way they could outrun them on foot. Their best chance was to fight their way out. But there was something else. He had been trained to fight, trained to kill when necessary. But this was different. Lyra wasn't just another enemy combatant. She was a survivor, just like him. And that meant something. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. The ravine gave them some cover, but it wasn't perfect. If the Scifi got too close, they'd be trapped. They needed to create a diversion, something that would buy them enough time to escape. Lyra, Aaron said, his voice steady, I need you to trust me. I'm going to create a distraction, and when I do, you run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. And you. I'll hold them off, Aaron said, his voice firm. Just stay safe. Lyra hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between him and the approaching soldiers. Then, without a word, she nodded. The Scifi were close now, too close. Aaron could hear their heavy boots crunching on the sand, the sound of their breathing through their helmets. There were at least 5 of them, all armed with plasma rifles. This was going to be a challenge. Aaron took a deep breath, his mind focused. He had done this before, many times, but something felt different this time. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something more. He was fighting for Lyra. With one last glance at her, Aaron leaped into action. He fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing off the rocks. The Scifi soldiers immediately stopped in their tracks, confused. They hadn't expected a fight, and that hesitation was all Aaron needed. Get down, he shouted to Lyra. She didn't need any further instruction. She ducked into the shadows, disappearing from view. Aaron quickly ducked behind a large boulder, his heart racing as he took aim at the approaching soldiers. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't going to let them capture Lyra, not without a fight. The Scifi moved forward cautiously, their rifles raised. They were scanning the area, trying to locate the source of the shot. Aaron's pulse quickened. He had only a few seconds before they spotted him. He waited until the nearest soldier was within range, then took a deep breath and fired. The shot rang out, striking the soldier's armor. The Scifi staggered back, surprised, but quickly regained their footing. Another shot rang out, and then another. Aaron moved quickly, using the boulders for cover as he shot and reloaded. The Scifi retaliated, their plasma rifles lighting up the night with deadly energy. The sand around Aaron exploded as they fired, but he kept his cool. He couldn't afford to miss. He couldn't afford to fail. The sound of the battle grew louder, but in the chaos, Aaron kept his focus. He could feel Lyra's presence behind him, even though he couldn't see her. She was still there, waiting for her moment. He just had to hold on long enough. The Scifi soldiers spread out, trying to surround him. Aaron cursed under his breath. He needed to end this quickly. Then, without warning, there was a sharp, high-pitched hum, a strange energy in the air. Lyra had done something. She had used her abilities. A wave of force erupted from behind him, throwing the Scifi soldiers off balance. They stumbled back, momentarily disoriented, as Lyra's power pushed them away. In that instant, Aaron knew it was time. Run, he yelled, giving her the signal. Lyra didn't hesitate. She darted from her hiding place, moving with incredible speed as she disappeared into the ravine. The Scifi soldiers, recovering from the shock of her attack, turned their attention to her, but it was too late. Aaron moved quickly, firing one last shot before sprinting after her. He didn't know how much time they had, but he wasn't going to waste any more. Not now. Together, they ran, faster than Aaron had ever run before. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. And with every step, he realized something important. No matter the odds, no matter the danger, they were in this together. They were both fighting for a future that was worth protecting. The cold desert wind howled through the ravine as Aaron and Lyra ran, their footsteps pounding in the sand. The Scifi soldiers were still hot on their trail, and Aaron's heart raced. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he could see the flicker of plasma shots lighting up the night sky. The blast of energy missed them by mere inches, and the heat from each shot sent a shiver down his spine. Lyra was faster than he had expected. Her agility, combined with her ability to manipulate energy, made her a formidable force. But she wasn't used to this kind of flight, and Aaron could sense her exhaustion. He knew they had to find shelter soon, or they wouldn't make it through the night. He didn't want to risk stopping, but they had no choice. They had to find a place to regroup and plan their next move. "We need to find cover," Aaron shouted over the wind, his voice barely carrying in the noise of the storm. Lyra didn't answer, but she nodded, her focus sharp as she kept pushing forward. The ground beneath them was uneven, with rocks jutting out of the sand like ancient bones. They were heading toward a narrow canyon that Aaron had spotted earlier, a place where the Scifi wouldn't be able to follow easily. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. They reached the canyon after a few more minutes of sprinting, breathless, and covered in sweat. The entrance was narrow, but once inside, the jagged walls offered some protection. Aaron led Lyra deeper into the canyon, stopping only when they were sure they were out of sight of their pursuers. They both sank to the ground, gasping for air. The silence that followed was deafening, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. "We should be safe for now," Aaron said, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Lyra nodded, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She wiped the sweat from her brow and then looked at him. Her violet eyes, wide and intense, seemed to pierce through him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me." Aaron glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together," he replied, his tone calm but determined. She didn't say anything for a moment, as though weighing his words. Then she spoke again. "You've risked everything for me. Why?" Aaron paused, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know why. Maybe it was because she was one of the few people he had met who didn't seem to fit into the typical enemy or ally categories. Maybe it was because, despite everything, she had shown kindness and resilience when the universe had shown her none. "I guess it's just who I am," Aaron said, shrugging. "I've seen too much death, too much destruction. I don't leave people behind. Not when I can help." Lyra studied him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "You are different from the others. Different from the soldiers who came before you." Aaron didn't know how to respond to that. There were so many things he wished he could explain to her, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned his attention back to the outside, keeping an ear out for any sounds that might signal the Scifi's approach. The storm had made it nearly impossible to see much beyond a few feet, but he wasn't taking any chances. "I'm going to scout ahead," Aaron said after a moment. "Stay here and don't move unless I say so." Lyra nodded, her face a mask of determination. "Be careful." Aaron gave her a reassuring smile before slipping out of the canyon. The wind had died down slightly, but the dust still made it hard to see. He moved cautiously, keeping low to the ground as he circled around the canyon's perimeter. The silence was unsettling, but he knew better than to trust it. As he moved deeper into the darkness, he heard a faint sound, an engine, perhaps. His pulse quickened. He had to be sure. He crept closer, his rifle raised, until he could make out the shape of a small Scifi patrol ship parked just beyond the ridge. There were 2 soldiers standing guard, their figures barely visible in the dim light. They seemed to be waiting for something. Aaron's mind raced as he considered his options. He could attack them now, but there were more ships out there, and he didn't want to risk drawing their attention. Instead, he crept back into the canyon, his mind working quickly. When he returned to Lara, she was waiting for him, just as he had asked. "There's a patrol ship nearby," Aaron said, his voice low. "2 soldiers, but there are likely more out there. We can't stay here for long." Lara's eyes flashed with recognition. "We need to keep moving. The longer we stay, the more likely they'll find us." Aaron nodded. "Exactly. We'll head north. There's a network of caves up that way. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to regroup." She didn't hesitate. Together, they moved silently through the canyon, retracing their steps as they headed for the northern caves. The terrain grew more uneven, the rocks sharper, but they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. As they neared the caves, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the storm clouds. Aaron squinted up at the sky, relieved to see the light after a long night of danger and uncertainty. The caves loomed ahead, a dark labyrinth in the rocky hillside. This would be their shelter for now, but Aaron knew it wouldn't be long before the Scifi forces would be searching for them again. He turned to Lara, his voice steady. "We'll rest here for a while, but we can't let our guard down." "Not yet." Lara gave him a small, knowing nod. "I understand. We'll be ready." And as they entered the darkness of the caves, Aaron felt a new sense of determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together. No matter the cost, they were not going to give up. Not now. Not ever. The deep darkness of the cave swallowed Aaron and Lara as they made their way deeper inside. The walls were jagged and cold, their surfaces rough against their skin as they carefully moved, trying to avoid making any noise. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the stillness, but they pressed on. They needed to find a place to rest and plan their next move. The caves stretched out ahead of them like a maze, and Aaron was certain that if they went far enough, they could find a safe spot to hide from the Scifi forces. Aaron glanced over at Lara. She had been quiet since they entered the cave, her eyes scanning the shadows around them, her pace steady. She was still recovering from the injuries she had sustained during their escape, but she hadn't shown any signs of slowing down. It was as if she had become more determined with every step. "How are you holding up?" Aaron asked, breaking the silence. Lara looked at him and smiled faintly, her violet eyes glowing softly in the dim light. "I'll be fine. I've been through worse." Aaron nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. He had learned that Lara wasn't someone to easily give up. She was strong, both physically and mentally. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like they were being watched. It was a feeling he couldn't quite explain, but it gnawed at him. He couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. "We should find shelter deeper in," Aaron said, his voice low but firm. "If the Scifi are close, they could follow our trail into the cave." Lara nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. I've been trying to keep track of their movements since we escaped, but I can feel their presence still. They are persistent." Aaron paused, sensing a slight hesitation in her voice. "Is something wrong?" he asked, concerned. Lara looked at him, her gaze hardening. "I sensed them before. The Scifi are relentless, but there's something else, something darker at work. I've felt this presence before, and it's not just their forces." Aaron frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Who else could be after us?" Lara hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing as she seemed to consider her words. "I don't know for certain, but I can feel the influence of a different force. It's like a shadow, moving just outside of my reach. It's not the Scifi, but they are somehow connected. Something ancient, something dangerous." Aaron's mind raced as he processed what she had just said. An ancient force. He had never heard of anything like that. The Xilkar were known for their advanced technology and brutal military tactics, but an ancient, shadowy force. It didn't make sense. I don't know what you mean, but we need to focus on getting out of here, Aaron said, trying to push aside his rising unease. We'll figure this out when we're safe. Liara nodded, but her eyes were distant, as if something was weighing heavily on her mind. Aaron had never seen her like this before. She wasn't the type to get distracted. He wasn't sure what she was sensing, but he could tell it was something powerful. They continued deeper into the cave, moving cautiously through narrow tunnels. The air grew colder, the stone walls slick with moisture. After a while, they found a small, sheltered alcove, hidden from view. It was quiet here, and the soft glow of Lyra's energy illuminated the area just enough for them to sit down and catch their breath. Aaron leaned against the wall, looking over at Lyra. She was sitting cross-legged, her hands resting on her knees as she closed her eyes in concentration. She seemed to be lost in thought, her face calm but serious. He knew she had been through a lot, but there was something more to her that he still didn't understand. She wasn't just another alien survivor. There was a mystery to her, a story she hadn't shared yet. And somehow, Aaron had the feeling that he was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. You said you've been through worse, Aaron said quietly, breaking the silence. What do you mean by that? Lyra opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was a quiet strength in her expression, something unspoken that Aaron couldn't quite place. I've survived wars, betrayals, and the destruction of my people, she said softly. But that's not all. I've faced the shadows before, and each time it's left its mark on me. Aaron felt a chill run down his spine. The shadows. What do you mean? Lyra hesitated before responding. I've been hunted before, by forces far more powerful than the Xilkar, the ones who destroyed my world. They were only a part of a larger plan. There's something much darker at work, something that I've been running from for years. Aaron's mind raced. This was more than just a fight for survival. Lyra wasn't just running from the Xilkar. She was running from something else, something even more dangerous. Why didn't you tell me before? Aaron asked, his voice filled with a mix of concern and confusion. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time since they met, Aaron saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I didn't want to drag you into this, she said quietly. I didn't want you to think I was just another survivor, someone to pity. I don't want your sympathy. I want your help. Aaron stared at her for a long moment. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the years she had spent running from whatever had been chasing her. But she was right. He wasn't here out of pity. He was here because he believed in her strength. And now, more than ever, he knew that their fight was far from over. We'll figure this out, Aaron said finally, his voice firm. We'll stop the Xilkar. We'll stop whatever else is out there. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite read. I don't know what's waiting for us, she said softly. But I know this. If we don't face it together, it will destroy us all. Aaron nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger than himself. And for Lyra. Whatever came next, he would stand by her side. Together, Aaron said. We'll face it together. And with that, they sat in the quiet of the cave, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. The air inside the cave was thick with tension. Aaron and Lyra sat in their small hiding place, each lost in their thoughts. The quiet seemed to stretch on forever, and yet neither of them felt safe. The deeper they went into the cave, the more Aaron felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were running out of time. The Xilkar wouldn't stop searching, and whatever dark force Lyra had sensed was closing in. We need to move, Aaron finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm but firm. We can't stay here much longer. Liara looked up from where she had been lost in thought, her face shadowed by worry. She nodded slowly, as though the decision had already been made in her mind. "You're right. But where do we go now?" Aaron glanced around, taking in their surroundings. The cave was narrow, with only a few exits. It wasn't the best place to be stuck, especially with danger lurking outside. He thought about the patrol ship he had seen earlier and the soldiers still hunting them. They had to get ahead of the Xilkar. They couldn't let them close the trap. "There's a settlement nearby," Aaron said after a moment of thought. "It's a small outpost, not far from here. We can make it there if we move quickly. It's not much, but it's better than being stuck in this cave." Liara's eyes flickered with a hint of doubt, but she nodded. "I've heard of it. It's not a safe place, though. The Xilkar have already taken over much of the region. That settlement could be crawling with their soldiers." Aaron looked at her, his expression serious. "We don't have a choice. If we stay here, they'll eventually find us. We need to keep moving, keep ahead of them." Liara hesitated, but the determination in her eyes told Aaron all he needed to know. She wasn't afraid of the dangers ahead. She was afraid of what the Xilkar would do to her if they caught up. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go." They both rose to their feet, and Aaron led the way through the twisting tunnels of the cave. The further they traveled, the colder the air became, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. Aaron's mind raced with plans and strategies, but his thoughts kept circling back to Lara. She had already been through so much. He had promised to help her, but he didn't know how far this journey would take them, or how much longer they could stay one step ahead of the Xilkar. After what felt like hours of winding through the caves, they'd reached a small, narrow opening that led to the outside. The air was still harsh, but it felt like a relief compared to the suffocating darkness of the cave. The settlement was just a few miles away now, but Aaron knew that the path to it wasn't going to be easy. As they moved toward the exit, Aaron heard a low hum in the distance, a sound that sent a chill down his spine. The Xilkar were near. "Get down," he hissed to Lara, grabbing her arm and pulling her to the ground behind a large boulder. They crouched in silence, watching as a patrol of Xilkar soldiers passed by, their large forms moving through the desert. The soldiers were heavily armed, their armor gleaming in the fading light. They were on alert, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Aaron held his breath, hoping they wouldn't notice the faint trail they had left behind. They had been careful, but the Xilkar's technology was far beyond anything the humans had. It wouldn't take much for them to pick up on their presence. Once the soldiers passed, Aaron and Lyra moved quickly, staying low to the ground and keeping to the shadows. They knew they couldn't afford to make a sound. Every step had to be calculated. Every movement had to be precise. They continued their journey toward the settlement, moving as quietly as possible. The night was dark, and the only light came from the distant stars above. Aaron kept a hand on his rifle, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As they neared the settlement, Aaron felt a sense of unease settle over him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, the same feeling he had experienced when they were in the cave. It wasn't just the Xilkar he had to worry about. There was something else, something more dangerous lurking in the shadows. "We're close," Aaron whispered, glancing at Lyra. She nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were wide, alert, scanning every corner of the landscape. She had sensed it too, the growing presence of something darker. They crept closer to the settlement, and Aaron could make out the outlines of buildings in the distance. The settlement was small, with only a handful of structures, but it seemed abandoned. The lights were off, and there were no signs of life. It was eerily quiet. "Where is everyone?" Lyra whispered, her voice tense. "I don't know," Aaron muttered, "but we need to get inside. Find some cover." They moved cautiously toward the nearest building, a small shack that appeared to be empty. Aaron tested the door. It creaked open with a soft groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the place was as deserted as it seemed from the outside. But there was something odd about it. The walls were marked with strange symbols, faded and worn from years of neglect. Aaron couldn't recognize them, but Lyara's eyes narrowed as she examined the markings. "What are these?" Aaron asked, stepping closer. Lyara stepped forward, her fingers brushing the symbols. "These are ancient markings," she said, her voice low. "They're not from the Xilkar. These symbols belong to the shadow force I've been running from. This place, it's a warning." Aaron's stomach dropped. They had stumbled into something far worse than the Xilkar. The settlement was more than just a hideout. It was a place that had been touched by the dark force Lyara had been sensing. And now, they were in its heart. Before Aaron could say anything more, the ground beneath them rumbled. The walls of the shack shook, and the air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. Something was coming. Something far worse than they had ever imagined. "We need to leave. Now," Aaron said, his voice urgent. But it was too late. The shadows were already closing in. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the strange energy surged through the air. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shack's walls rattled, and a cold, oppressive feeling filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Something was here, something far more dangerous than the Xilkar. Lyara's expression was grim as she looked at the symbols on the walls, her eyes wide with realization. "We've made a grave mistake," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "This place is cursed. The shadows I've been running from. They're here." Aaron's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't let whatever this dark force was, whatever it was that had been chasing Lyara for so long, catch up to them. But the energy was growing stronger by the second, and it felt like the very air around them was alive with something ancient and malevolent. "Lyara, we need to get out," Aaron said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Now." But Lyara didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the symbols, her body tense, as if she were sensing something that Aaron couldn't. "I can't leave. Not yet. If I don't stop it now, it will destroy everything. Everyone." Aaron was confused. "What are you talking about? What do you need to stop?" "The Force," Lyara said, her voice low and determined. "It's not just a presence. It's a being. An ancient entity that feeds off fear and destruction. It's been manipulating the Xilkar, using their war to spread its influence. But it needs me. It's been after me for years because I carry the key to stopping it." Aaron's head spun as he tried to process her words. He had no idea what she was talking about, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was coming, they weren't going to be able to stop it alone. "You don't have to do this," Aaron said, grabbing her shoulders. "We'll find another way. We'll run. We'll fight. We'll—" "No," Lyara cut him off, her voice firm. "I have to do this. If I don't, it will destroy everything. The Xilkar, the people of this world, everyone I've ever known. It will keep spreading until there's nothing left." Aaron hesitated, seeing the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't going to back down. And if she was right, they didn't have much time. The force was closing in, and it would be too powerful to fight head-on. "Then tell me what we need to do," Aaron said, his voice filled with determination. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. Lyara nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "There's an altar deep beneath the settlement. I can feel it, the source of its power. If I can reach it and activate the energy that's locked away there, I can disrupt the force's hold. But I'll need time, and I'll need your help to protect me while I do it." Aaron knew this wasn't going to be easy. He didn't have the experience to fight whatever dark entity was behind this, but he wasn't about to let Lyara face it alone. They had come this far together. Now they had no choice but to see it through. "We'll do it," Aaron said firmly, his voice steady. "Just tell me what we need to do." Lyara gave him a grateful look before motioning for him to follow her. They hurried through the settlement, moving as quickly as they could while keeping an eye out for any signs of the force's influence. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the sky above them seemed to darken with an unnatural storm. The air was thick with the energy of the entity, making every step feel like they were walking through thick mud. As they reached the heart of the settlement, they came upon a small, hidden door in the ground. It was covered with symbols, much like those inside the shack, and it pulsed with dark energy. Liara stepped forward, placing her hand on the door, her eyes closed in concentration. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is the altar. It's the only way." Aaron kept watch, his senses on high alert as he scanned the area. The air was buzzing with the power of the entity, and he could feel something watching them, something waiting for them to slip up. Liara raised her hand, and the symbols on the door began to glow with a strange, eerie light. The ground shook beneath their feet as the door slowly creaked open, revealing the deep chamber below. It was dark, but as Liara stepped forward, the shadows seemed to retreat, revealing an ancient structure at the center of the room. "This is where it all began," Liara said softly, her voice filled with awe and fear. "This is where the dark force's power is bound. If I can activate the altar, I can sever its connection to the Xilkar, and to me." Aaron nodded, his grip tightening around his rifle as he stepped forward to stand beside her. "You'll have the time you need," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I won't let it touch you." Liara gave him a grateful smile, then turned her attention to the altar. She began to chant softly in a language Aaron didn't understand, her hands moving in intricate patterns as she called upon the energy that had been locked away for so long. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around them as the energy grew stronger. Aaron felt a deep, unsettling chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. He couldn't afford to let fear control him now. As Liara continued her chant, the entity's presence grew stronger, the room shaking with its power. It was coming for them. "Stay focused, Liara," Aaron said, his voice urgent. "I've got you covered." The shadows writhed in the corners of the room, and Aaron could feel them moving closer. But he didn't flinch. This was the moment they had been preparing for. This was their final stand. The energy around them exploded with a deafening roar as Liara's chant reached its peak. The shadows froze, and for a brief moment, the world stood still. Then, with a final, blinding flash of light, everything went silent.